The rain outside seemed louder now, as if it was trying to break through the walls of my quiet, carefully ordered life. I stood frozen in front of Daniel, his words still hanging in the air between us like some surreal confession I wasn't prepared to hear. My son, the boy I had raised, the man I thought I knew, was standing there, telling me something so absurd, so wrong, that I couldn't fully comprehend it. "I don't love her," he had said, his voice low and steady, as if he had rehearsed this in his mind 1,000 times. "Not the way I should. Not the way a husband should." I stared at him, trying to keep my breathing even, my thoughts clear, but inside, everything was chaos. The Daniel I knew had always been so certain, so strong. Even as a child, he was fiercely independent, though he had always come to me when something troubled him. We'd spent countless nights talking through his fears, his hopes, his dreams. And now, as a grown man, he stood before me, vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen in years. But this was different. I turned away from him, trying to regain my composure, watching the rain hit the glass in erratic patterns. The soft light from the street lamps outside reflected off the wet window, casting a dull glow across the room. I couldn't look at him. I didn't know how. How could he say something like this? "What are you talking about, Daniel?" I finally asked, my voice quieter than I intended. This isn't right. You're married. You've built a life with Sophia." His silence was more telling than any words he could have said. I could feel his gaze on me, heavy and unrelenting, but I didn't turn around. Not yet. I needed a moment to steady myself. "I know," he said quietly, almost as if he was agreeing with me. "I know I'm married, but that doesn't change what I feel." His voice wavered, and when I finally found the strength to face him, I saw it. The raw, unfiltered emotion in his eyes, something I hadn't noticed before. There was pain there, confusion, longing, and something else, something that unsettled me deeply. "No, Daniel," I said, shaking my head slowly, trying to inject some reason into this madness. "You're confused. You're going through something. Maybe it's the stress, or you and Sophia are having problems, but what you're saying, it isn't real. It can't be." He took a step toward me, closing the distance between us, but it wasn't threatening. It was slow, measured, almost tentative. His hand lifted, not to touch me, but as if he didn't quite know what to do with it. He let it fall back to his side. "I've thought about this for a long time," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's not confusion, Mom. It's just how I feel. I've tried to push it down, tried to ignore it, but I can't." His words left me feeling exposed, vulnerable in a way I hadn't felt in years. My heart raced, but not in the way one would expect from hearing something so startling. It was more the fear of what could follow, the uncertainty of how I should respond. I was his mother, the one who had taught him about right and wrong, the one who had always been his guide. And now, here he was, breaking every boundary that should have existed between us. "I'm your mother, Daniel," I said, my voice cracking slightly. I hated how weak I sounded, how unsure I was of my own words. This isn't possible. It's wrong." "I know it's wrong," he replied, his eyes never leaving mine. "But I can't stop feeling this way. And I need you to understand that." Understand? How could I possibly understand this? My chest tightened as I tried to think of what to say, how to fix this, how to make him see reason. But before I could speak, he reached out. Just a fleeting touch, his fingers grazing my arm, barely more than a whisper of contact. But it was enough to make my breath catch in my throat. I stepped back instinctively, but not far enough to break the connection between us. I didn't want to push him away, not really. And maybe that was what terrified me the most, that some part of me didn't want to reject him outright. "Daniel, please," I whispered, not even sure what I was asking for. Clarity, distance. I wasn't sure anymore. For a moment he didn't move. He stood there, watching me, as if weighing his next words carefully. Then, with a quiet sigh, he stepped forward again, this time reaching up to gently touch my cheek. It wasn't intimate, not really. It was more a gesture of understanding, of connection, the way he had done when he was younger, seeking comfort, reassurance. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice low and heavy with the weight of everything unspoken. His hand lingered on my cheek for just a second longer, and then, to my surprise, he leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to my cheek. It was so tender, so simple, yet it shattered something inside me. It wasn't the kiss of a son seeking his mother's comfort. It wasn't that at all. There was something deeper, something unspoken, in the way his lips lingered against my skin, just for a moment longer than they should have. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, confusion, fear, a strange, unsettling warmth that I didn't know how to explain. When he finally pulled back, there was a silence between us, thick with all the things that had been said and those that had not. His eyes met mine again, and I could see the conflict there, the same conflict that was raging inside me. "I'll stop," he said, though it sounded like a lie even as he said it. "I'll stop if you want me to." But I didn't answer. I didn't know how. Instead, I turned away from him again, staring out at the rain, feeling his presence behind me like a weight I couldn't shake. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, the remnants of last night's conversation still weighing heavy on my mind. I tried to shake it off, tried to tell myself that it was over, that Daniel had said what he needed to say and we could move on. But there was no moving on, not really. His words had seeped into the quiet corners of my mind, impossible to ignore. I went about my morning routine, attempting to distract myself with the mundane, making coffee, straightening the kitchen, the usual. But as I stood at the counter, stirring sugar into my mug, the doorbell rang. My heart skipped a beat. I already knew who it was before I even opened the door. There he stood, Daniel, suitcase in hand, his eyes soft and pleading. For a brief moment, I was speechless. He hadn't said anything about coming back so soon. The rational part of me screamed that I should send him away, that he needed to go home, figure things out with Sophia. But the part of me that was his mother, the part of me that had always wanted to protect him, to give him what he needed, couldn't bring herself to close the door. "I need time," he said, his voice steady, though I could see the tension in his jaw. I need time to clear my head, to figure this out. I should have refused. I should have told him no, that this wasn't the answer, that he needed to go back to his wife. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I stepped aside, letting him inside. He set his suitcase down by the couch and gave me a small, almost apologetic smile. It was strange having him here again. It reminded me of when he was younger, when he would come home from school and drop his things carelessly by the door, expecting me to be there, to listen, to take care of him. It felt oddly familiar, yet so different now. There was something fragile between us, something unspoken that neither of us knew how to address. The days passed in an odd, delicate rhythm. Daniel moved through my home as if he had always belonged there, and in some ways he had. He fixed the broken kitchen cabinet that had been bothering me for months, brought back my favorite jasmine tea from the store, and stayed up late talking, just like he used to when he was a boy. But now, those conversations carried a weight they never had before, a tension that neither of us could ignore. One evening, a few days after he had moved in, we sat down to watch a film together. It was a quiet evening, the rain from the past few days having let up, leaving the air outside cool and damp. I chose an old movie, something nostalgic and safe, hoping that the simplicity of it would distract from everything that had been left unsaid between us. Daniel sat across from me, on the other side of the couch, but I could feel his presence like a weight pressing against me. I tried to focus on the film, on the familiar scenes playing out in front of me, but my mind kept wandering. His gaze, his words, the way he looked at me as if I were the center of his universe. It unsettled me in ways I wasn't ready to admit. As we watched, there were moments when our arms would brush, fleeting, innocent touches that sent my heart racing despite my best efforts to stay calm. I told myself it was nothing, just accidental contact, but each time, I could feel the tension building, a tension that neither of us acknowledged. And then, without warning, he reached out again, his hand resting lightly on my arm. It was just a simple touch, but it felt like so much more. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned to look at him, finding his eyes already on me. There was something in his gaze, something intense and vulnerable all at once. "I don't know how to stop this," he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest, unsure of how to respond. I didn't know how to stop it either. I didn't even know if I wanted to. But I couldn't say that, not to him, not out loud. Instead, I shook my head, trying to regain control of the situation, of my emotions. "Daniel, you have to," I said, though the words sounded weak, even to me. This can't happen. You need to go back to Sophia. His hand slid down my arm, his touch gentle but lingering, and for a moment I thought he would pull away, that he would leave it at that. But then, before I could react, he leaned in and kissed me. Not on the cheek this time, but softly, tentatively on the lips. It was brief, barely more than a brush of skin, but it sent shockwaves through me. I should have pulled away. I should have stopped him. But I didn't. Instead, I let it happen. My heart racing. My mind a blur of confusion and emotions I couldn't name. When he pulled back, his eyes searched mine looking for something. Maybe a sign of rejection. Maybe a sign of acceptance. I didn't know. I didn't have the strength to give him either. Please, he whispered, his voice raw, almost desperate. Just tell me you feel something. I looked away, unable to meet his gaze, because the truth was, I did feel something. Something I didn't want to acknowledge. Something that terrified me. But I couldn't tell him that. I couldn't let this spiral any further. So I did the only thing I could think of. You need to leave, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. You need to go. He didn't move right away. For a long moment, he just stood there, watching me, his expression a mix of hurt and confusion. But then, with a quiet nod, he stepped back. I'll go, he said softly. But I won't stop feeling this. And with that, he turned and left, leaving me standing alone in the dimly lit room, my heart still racing, my mind spinning with everything that had just happened. The days following Daniel's departure felt strange, almost surreal. I kept busy, immersing myself in work, household chores, anything to keep my mind off what had happened. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, the memories lingered. The feel of his hand on my arm, the soft brush of his lips against mine, the intensity of his words, they all haunted me, creeping into my thoughts when I least expected them. I told myself that it was over, that I had put an end to it by asking him to leave. He would go back to Sophia, they would work things out, and life would return to normal. At least, that's what I tried to convince myself. But deep down, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. Something had shifted between us, something that couldn't be undone. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I came home to the familiar emptiness of my apartment. The silence was comforting in a way, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions that had been swirling inside me since Daniel's confession. But as I sat down on the couch, staring at the untouched cup of tea I had made for myself, I realized just how much I missed him. Not just the son I had raised, but the man he had become. The man who had looked at me with such raw emotion, such intensity. I shook my head, trying to push those thoughts away. This was wrong. I knew that. I had to keep reminding myself of it. But no matter how hard I tried, the memories kept resurfacing, and with them, the confusing feelings that I couldn't quite shake. It was late, well past midnight, when my phone rang. The sound startled me, pulling me out of my thoughts, and I hesitated for a moment before picking it up. I didn't need to check the caller ID. I already knew who it was. Mom. Daniel's voice was soft, almost hesitant on the other end of the line. I'm sorry to call so late, I needed to hear your voice. My heart clenched at his words, and for a brief moment, I considered hanging up. I should have. I knew I should. But instead, I found myself gripping the phone tighter, the familiar pull of him drawing me in once again. Daniel, you shouldn't be calling me, I said, though my voice lacked the conviction I had hoped for. You need to focus on your marriage, on Sophia. There was a long pause on the other end, and I could hear the faint sound of him exhaling, as if he was struggling to find the right words. I can't, he finally said, his voice tinged with frustration. I can't stop thinking about you, about what happened. I feel lost, Mom. I don't know what to do. His words sent a jolt through me, and for a moment, I was at a loss for how to respond. The rational part of me screamed that I needed to end this conversation, that I needed to cut him off before things spiral further. But then I heard it, that unmistakable vulnerability in his voice, the same vulnerability I had heard when he was younger, coming to me with his problems, looking to me for answers. I'm trying to figure it out, he continued, his voice quieter now. But I can't do this alone. I need you. The air felt heavy between us, even through the phone, and I found myself closing my eyes, leaning back against the couch, the weight of everything pressing down on me. "Daniel, I can't help you with this," I said softly, though I wasn't sure I even believed my own words anymore. "You have to find your own way through this. You have a wife, a life." "I know," he interrupted, his voice firmer now. "But that doesn't change how I feel. And I don't think it ever will." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. What could I possibly say? I was torn between the part of me that knew this was wrong and the part of me that wanted to comfort him, to give him what he needed, even if it meant crossing a line that should never have been crossed. Just tell me you feel nothing," he said, his voice barely a whisper now. "Tell me this is one-sided, that I'm imagining everything." I didn't answer. I couldn't. The truth was too tangled up in everything else. The memories, the feelings, the overwhelming confusion that clouded my judgment. I wanted to tell him that this wasn't real, that it was just a moment of weakness, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. "I can't," I whispered, my voice so quiet I wasn't sure if he even heard me. There was a long silence on the other end, and for a moment, I thought he might have hung up. But then he spoke again, his voice softer, more resigned. "I'll be over tomorrow." Before I could protest, the line went dead. The next day, as promised, he showed up at my door. I had tried to prepare myself, to remind myself of everything that was at stake, everything that was wrong about this. But when I opened the door and saw him standing there, his eyes searching mine, I felt that same pull, that same irrational need to let him in. And I did. This time, there were no awkward explanations, no apologies. He stepped inside, the suitcase noticeably absent this time. He wasn't here to stay, just to see me. His presence felt different now. He moved through my space with a quiet confidence, like he belonged there, like this was where he had always been meant to be. It was unsettling, yet comforting all at once. That evening, we sat together in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows across the walls. We didn't watch a movie this time. Instead, we talked. It was almost like old times, like when he was younger and would sit with me, telling me about his day, asking for advice. But now, the topics were heavier, the unspoken tension between us ever present. At one point, as we sat in silence, he reached out again, his hand resting on my knee, a gesture that was both comforting and charged with something more. I looked at him, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to react. His thumb brushed gently against my leg, a fleeting touch that sent shivers through me. "I don't want to lose you," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "You won't," I replied, though the words felt hollow, given everything that had happened between us. Before I could say anything more, he leaned in again, this time slower, more deliberate. His lips found mine, soft and tentative at first, but quickly deepening into something more. It wasn't just a fleeting kiss like before. This time, it was filled with everything we hadn't said, everything we had been avoiding for days. I kissed him back. For that brief moment, I allowed myself to let go, to surrender to the emotions I had been holding back. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, and I didn't resist. The kiss lingered, soft but filled with a sense of inevitability, as though we both knew this was bound to happen. When we finally pulled away, our foreheads resting against each other, the air between us felt thick with emotion. "We shouldn't," I whispered, though I knew the words had lost all meaning now. "I know," he murmured back, his breath warm against my skin. "But I don't care." Neither did I. Not anymore. The following day, I found myself getting ready for dinner with a sense of unease. I had agreed to meet Daniel, but as I stood in front of the mirror, choosing what to wear, a heavy sense of anticipation settled in. It felt strange, dressing for what was supposed to be a simple dinner. Yet the weight of it all pressed down on me. As I left the apartment, I told myself this was just another meal with my son, nothing more. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple anymore. The lines between us had blurred in ways I hadn't been able to foresee, and meeting him now felt different, like I was walking into something far more complicated. The restaurant was quiet, a small, cozy place with dim lighting and soft music playing in the background. When I arrived, Daniel was already there, waiting at a table by the window. His eyes met mine as I walked in, and for a moment, I felt the familiar pull that had been growing between us. There was no denying it now. What had started as something confusing had grown into something that neither of us could ignore. He stood as I approached, his presence commanding in a way I hadn't noticed before. He looked different, more composed, more certain, as if he had come to terms with something that I was still struggling to accept. We sat down, and the evening unfolded slowly. There was a carefulness in our conversation, a delicate balance as we navigated around the things we both wanted to say but couldn't. The small talk was just that, small, inconsequential. But the silence between words was heavy, charged with everything we weren't acknowledging. As the meal went on, the subtle touches became more noticeable. His hand would rest on the table just a little too close to mine. The brush of his arm against mine as he reached for his drink was no longer accidental. There were fleeting moments where our gazes would lock, and in those moments, I could feel the depth of what lay beneath the surface, even if neither of us said a word about it. At one point, as we lingered over the remnants of our meal, Daniel leaned slightly closer, his fingers lightly grazing my arm as he spoke. It was a gentle, almost innocent touch, but it sent a ripple through me. There was something so intimate in that brief contact, something that made me acutely aware of how much had changed between us. As we prepared to leave, he reached for my coat, helping me slip it on with a quiet tenderness. His fingers brushed against the back of my neck as he adjusted the collar, and then, without warning, he leaned in and kissed me softly on the cheek. It wasn't a kiss of passion or desire, but one of understanding, a silent acknowledgement of everything we had shared, of the unspoken connection that had grown between us. The moment lingered, his lips warm against my skin for just a second longer than necessary, before he pulled away, leaving me standing there, stunned by the depth of that simple gesture. It was as if, in that kiss, we both understood what was happening, even if neither of us could fully admit it. We parted ways shortly after, but the kiss stayed with me, lingering like an unspoken promise. As I walked back to my apartment, the night air cool against my skin, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end, that this dinner, this kiss, was only the beginning of something much more complex than I had ever anticipated. The days following our dinner felt like living in a strange, alternate reality. Everything had shifted, subtly at first, but undeniably. The boundary that once existed between Daniel and me, the clear line that separated mother from son, had all but vanished. I could feel it in every interaction, every look, every brief touch. The intimacy between us, unspoken yet ever-present, was no longer something I could ignore. I found myself thinking about it constantly, how we had gotten here, how we had crossed into this space that felt so dangerous, so wrong, yet so inescapably real. I could no longer pretend that this was temporary, a fleeting misstep that would correct itself in time. No, this was something far more complex. The emotional lines between us had blurred, and now I couldn't even tell where I ended and he began. Then came the call I had been dreading. Daniel had filed for divorce. I hadn't expected it so soon, perhaps not at all. But deep down, I knew this was the inevitable outcome. Sophia had never truly held his heart. I had become the center of his life, the focal point of all his desires and unresolved feelings. I didn't need to hear the specifics of the divorce. The reasons were clear. He was doing this for us, for the life he envisioned with me. I should have been horrified. The rational part of me still knew how wrong this all was, how twisted. But I was so tired of resisting, tired of fighting what had been building between us for months. I had spent so long trying to push him away, to remind him of the boundaries that should have been there, but all that effort had worn me down. Every time I tried to reinforce those boundaries, they seemed to dissolve, leaving us standing on the same side of a line that no longer existed. I had tried, hadn't I, to hold on to the roles we were supposed to play, mother, son. But those titles felt hollow now, meaningless in the face of what we had become to each other. Our relationship had transformed into something far more complicated, something I couldn't easily label or define. I had spent so much time resisting, convincing myself that I had control over the situation, over my emotions. But I didn't. Maybe I never did. When Daniel told me about the divorce, there was no shock, no protest left in me. I had already resigned myself to the fact that this was happening, whether I liked it or not. He had chosen this path, and deep down I had chosen it too. I had allowed him back into my life, allowed the lines to blur until I could no longer tell where propriety ended and desire began. I had let him in, And now I had to face the consequences of that decision. He spoke about building a life together, about how things would be once the divorce was finalized. And as much as I wanted to tell him it was impossible, that this was madness, I found myself nodding along, agreeing in silence. Not because I thought it was right, but because I was simply too tired to keep fighting. The truth was, I had lost the will to resist him. He had become such a constant presence in my life, in my thoughts, that the idea of pushing him away now seemed almost unimaginable. I had tried to be strong, to uphold the boundaries that were supposed to keep us apart, but they had eroded under the weight of everything we had shared. Every stolen glance, every fleeting touch, every whispered confession had chipped away at those barriers until there was nothing left. Now, as I sit here, reflecting on everything that has happened, I realize that this is the life we have chosen. I don't know where it will lead us, or how we'll navigate the complexities of a relationship built on broken boundaries and unresolved emotions. But I do know that I am no longer fighting it. Daniel has made his choice, and in a way so have I. I'm tired of resisting, tired of pretending that things can go back to the way they were. They can't, and maybe that's okay. Maybe, in some strange way, this is what was always meant to happen. Our lives intertwining in ways neither of us could have anticipated. The boundaries may have blurred, but what's left is something real, something undeniable. And now, as we step into this uncertain future together, I know there's no turning back.